I want to turn it over to Mr. John Provine, and he is going to introduce the Chautauqua in the Schools program and how this was able to happen here at Waller today and how it's happened for several years. But please give him a warm Waller welcome.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a privilege to be here. My name is John Provine. I've come with my wife, Laurel. We're representing the Chautauqua Council of Enid, okay? How many of you have heard that term, Chautauqua? Okay, good, a great number of you, especially back over there. All right, Chautauqua is an Indian word. Okay, it refers to a lake in western New York where Chautauqua meetings began over 140 years ago. So they've been around in America for a long, long time. Chautauqua is a program of education and entertainment. We're still having Chautauqua today. Chautauqua was alive and well in Enid way back in its early days, in the early 1900s, soon after the settling of the Cherokee Strip. And it's alive and well in Enid today. In fact, we've had Chautauqua programs here in Enid consecutively for the last 20 years. So it's been around. This is the first time we've been in Waller in a good number of years. So we're really glad to be here and to share this kind of program with you. The Modern Chautauqua is a program of historical characterization, okay? We bring to you important characters from our past and give you an interpretation of them. Obviously, these people are no longer living, so that means a scholar has to study the character, dress like the character, talk like the character, become the character for you. So that's what you're actually going to see today. Now, our character is Washington Irving. How many of you have read any of his works? Okay, good. There are a bunch of hands going up. Washington Irving, let me help you put it in perspective. Washington Irving was born at the very end of the Revolutionary War. He's born in 1783 when America, the United States, first becomes an independent country. Okay? He lives a long life and dies in 1859, right before the Civil War begins. So if you ever have to think about where does Washington Irving fit in the timeline of American history, he put him between those two major wars in America. Now, he became a very popular, very talented writer. There had been people in America who'd been writing ever since they came over to settle the country. But he's the first one who was able to earn his living with his writing, okay? He's the first one who could put the bread and butter on his table and take care of his family with his writing. So he won quite a bit of acclaim. You know, if you looked at Washington Irving, if you were knowing him back in his day when he was around, he would have been as popular as a rock star today. Okay? I don't think he quite has that image among people's minds in this day and age. But when he was alive, throngs gathered to see him. Important people wanted to talk with him. Okay? So just keep that in your mind. He was as important as any rock star today. Now, the format of a Chautauqua program is the presentation of the character that lasts about 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes. And then there is an opportunity at the end of the program for you as an audience to ask questions of Washington Irving. So while you're listening, keep in mind what you might ask as a question to further your information and your understanding of Washington Irving and his writings. And then after that question time where you address the character as the character, then the person who is presenting will come out of character, tell you his real name, his today name, and allow you to ask him questions as the scholar. Now, there are some questions you can't ask Washington Irving, right? Because a lot of people want to ask, when did you die? Well, if Washington Irving's up there talking to you, he's not dead, right? So he can't answer that question. So think about the type of question you ask. Be sure it's something that Washington Irving would know something about. Obviously, he wouldn't know anything about receiving a text or carrying a cell phone or anything like that. So this is an opportunity for you to look at our past and to participate in it. Now, with no further ado then, it is my great privilege to introduce you to the world-renowned author and writer, Washington Irving.
Thank you for the gracious introduction. In 1802, when I was 19 years old, I introduced my first appearance in print as the superfluous observations of an odd old fellow. These were the letters of Jonathan Oldstyle, gentleman. Of course, then, at the age of 19, I was only pretending to be old and odd. And now, nearly 5 decades later, I find myself rather more genuinely old and odd, and still offering superfluous observations. You see, I was always fond of visiting new scenes and observing strange characters and manners. And it was always either my good or evil lot to have my roving passion gratified. As it is now the fashion for modern tourists to travel with a pen or a pencil in hand and to bring home portfolios filled with sketches and memorandums, I find myself inclined to jot down notes and memorandums in my ever-present journals and sketchbooks. I see here that when I was last in Oklahoma Territory, it was in 1832, I noted in my journal that all around was a vast tract of uninhabited country, where there was neither to be seen the log house of the white man nor the wigwam of the Indian, but only great grassy plains interspersed with forests and groves and clumps of trees, and watered by the Arkansas River. Over these fertile and verdant wastes roamed the elk, the buffalo, and the wild horse in all their native freedom. Looking around today, I feel rather like my character Rip Van Winkle, awakening after a 20-year sleep. There were rows of houses which he had never seen before. Strange names over the doors, strange faces at the windows. Everything was strange. His mind now misgave him, and he began to doubt whether both he and the world were not bewitched. Oh, that drink last night, thought he, has addled my poor brain sadly. You see, throughout my life, and over the course of my many travels, I have always been haunted by the effect that the passage of time works on people and places and even nations. Born as I was in 1783, the year that the Treaty of Paris formally concluded our American War for Independence, I have grown up with these United States, observing and participating in the many changes of our nation, including the creation of a native literature on the foundations of old world traditions. I started writing merely on a whim. Those letters of Jonathan Oldstyle were published by my older brother Peter in his newspaper, the Morning Chronicle. And then, a few years later, my eldest brother, William, I'm the youngest of 8 children. I have 4 elder brothers, 3 elder sisters. My eldest brother, William, and his brother-in-law, James Kirk Paulding, and I began to publish a satirical and comedic periodical that we called Salmagundi, or the Whim, Whams, and Opinions of Lancelot Langstaff, Esquire, and others. We were laughing philosophers, clearly of the opinion that wisdom, true wisdom, is a plump, jolly dame who sits in her armchair and laughs right merrily at the farce of life and takes the world as it comes. I was only half educated. My schooling was spotty and undisciplined. Although in our home in New York City, my elder brothers and I had ample leisure for speech-making, for music, for writing, drawing, and painting. My sister Catherine had a hopeful beau by the name of John Anderson, who was quite adroit with pen and brush, and he bestowed upon our family many of his paintings and drawings. He deigned to show me his sketchbook, and he even gave me one of my own. And to this day, I very much enjoy the company of painters and artists, and I've been known to dabble with painting a little myself, although I learned early on that my talent lay in sketching with words rather than pictures. My father dubbed me the philosopher for my lonely and abstracted habits, always reading and dreaming of travel. For me, a book of travel was like a coach at the door. I must jump in and take a ride. Through reading, I was early exposed to the poetical and historical associations of people and places and customs in Europe. As I grew into boyhood, I extended the range of my observations, and I would spend my afternoon holidays rambling about the countryside along the Hudson River. I made myself acquainted with every place famous in history or fable. I knew every spot where a murder was committed or a robbery done, and where a ghost was seen. I ventured into the villages of the old Dutch settlers and greatly extended my stock of knowledge by conversing with their sages and their great men. And in this way, I amassed a stock of stories that later became part of my published tales and sketches, such as this one entitled The Haunted House. From the manuscripts of Diedrich Knickerbocker. In the neighborhood of the ancient city of the Manhattoes, there stood not very many years since an old mansion, which when I was a boy went by the name of the Haunted House. It was one of the very few remains of the architecture of the early Dutch settlers, and it must have been a house of some consequence at the time when it was built. It consisted of a center and 2 wings, the gable ends of which were shaped like stairs. The house stood remote from the road in the center of a large field, with an avenue of old locust trees leading up to it, several of which had been shivered by lightning, and 2 or 3 blown down. A few apple trees grew straggling about the field. There were traces also of what had once been a kitchen garden, but the fences were broken down, the vegetables had disappeared or had grown wild or turned to little better than weeds. with here and there a ragged rose bush or a tall sunflower shooting up from among the brambles and hanging its head sorrowfully as if in contemplation of the desolation around it. Part of the roof of the old house had fallen in. The windows were shattered, and the panels of the doors were broken and mended with rough boards. And there were two rusty weathercocks at the ends of the house, which always made a great jingling and whistling as they whirled about, but never pointed correctly. The appearance of the whole place was forlorn and desolate at the best of times. But in unruly weather, the howling of the wind about the crazy old mansion, the screeching of the weathercocks, the slamming and the banging of the loose window shutters had altogether so wild and dreary an effect that the neighborhood stood perfectly in awe of the place and pronounced it the rendezvous of hobgoblins. I recollect the old building well, for I remember how many times when an idle, unlucky urchin I've prowled around its precincts with some of my graceless companions on holiday afternoons, went out on a freebooting cruise among the orchards. There was a tree standing near the house that bore the most beautiful and tempting fruit. But then it was on enchanted ground, for the place was so charmed by the frightful stories that we dreaded to approach it. Sometimes we would venture in a body and get near the Hesperian tree, keeping an eye on the old mansion and darting fearful glances into its shattered windows. And when, just as we were about to seize our prize, an exclamation from some one of our gang or an accidental noise would throw us all into a panic, and we would scamper headlong from the place and not stop till we had got quite into the road. Oh, and then there were sure to be a host of fearful anecdotes told of strange cries and groans, or of some hideous face suddenly seen at one of the windows. So, by degrees, we ceased to venture into these lonely grounds, but would stand at a distance and throw stones at the building. Oh, and there was something fearfully pleasing in the sound as they rattled along the roof and sometimes struck jingling fragments of glass out of one of the windows. The origin of the house was lost in the obscurity that covers the early period of the province. The reason of its having fallen to decay was a matter of dispute, but the most current, and of course the most probable account, was that it was haunted and that nobody could live quietly in it. Oh, there can in fact be very little doubt that this was the case, because there were so many corroborating stories to prove it. Not a woman in the neighborhood but could furnish a score of them. There was an old gray-headed curmudgeon of a Negro that lived hard by, who had a whole budget of these stories to tell, many of which had happened to himself. I recollect many a time stopping with my schoolmates and getting him to relate some. The old crone lived in a hovel in the midst of a small patch of potatoes and Indian corn, which his master had given him on setting him free. He would come to us with his hoe in his hand, and as we sat perched like a row of swallows on the rail of the fence in the mellow summer twilight of a summer evening, he would tell us such fearful stories, accompanied by such awful rollings of his eyes, that we were almost afraid of our own footsteps when we returned home after dark. Ah, poor old Pompey. Many years have passed since he died and went to keep company with the ghosts he was so fond of telling us about. He was buried in a corner of his little potato patch, The plow soon passed over his grave and leveled it with the rest of the field. And nobody thought any more of the old Negro. By singular chance, I was strolling in that neighborhood several years afterwards, when I had grown up to be a young man, and I found a knot of gossip speculating on a skull which had just been turned up by a plowshare. They, of course, determined it to be the remains of someone that had been murdered. And they had raked it up, and along with it some of the traditionary tales of the haunted house. I knew it at once to be but the relics of poor Pompey. But I held my tongue, for I am too considerate of other people's enjoyment ever to mar a good story of a murder or a ghost. I took care, though, to see the bones of my old friend once more buried in a place where they were not likely to be disturbed. As I grew older, my rambles about the Hudson Valley came to an end, as I was a man of some quickness of study. I was intended for the law, which, as we all know, is the path to all honor and preferment in contemporary America. Is that not so? I was assigned to study with Judge Josiah Hoffman, a man very learned and distinguished in matters of law and politics. He took quite an interest in me, though I was a very heedless student. He made me practically an inmate of his house. I took a particular interest in his daughter, Matilda. But it was little more than a mere boyish fancy. I don't mean to be too minute and to make this a romantic story. After a time, the delicate state of my health induced my family to send me to Europe. I was absent for 2 years, from 1804 to 1806, and when I returned, I resumed my legal studies. I recollect as if it were yesterday when I saw Matilda again. Oh, what a difference the interval of 2 years had made. She was but between 15 and 16 years old. I had never seen anything so lovely. I adored Matilda. But this passion went terribly against my legal studies. I was able, though, to pass a test in November of 1806 and to be admitted to the bar, more through courtesy than desert, I am afraid, for I scarcely answered a single question correctly. Judge Hoffman told a legal associate of his that I knew a little law, and that astute gentleman replied, "Make it stronger, Josiah, damned little." And I admitted my own deficiencies. I despaired of ever succeeding at the law. I had developed a fatal propensity for belles lettres, and I had secretly engaged upon writing a humorous and satirical history of New York, Diedrich Knickerbocker's History of New York. And I hoped that that would be my path to some position and preferment in society. But in the midst of this struggle and anxiety over my career, Matilda was taken ill with a consumption. Her malady was rapid in its progress, and it hurried her off in 2 months. Her dying struggle was painful and protracted. I was the last person she looked upon. She died when she was but 17 years old. I abandoned all thoughts of the law. The anguish, you see, that attended this catastrophe threw a cloud over my disposition and gave a turn to my mind that has stayed with me ever since. When I finally was able to become calm and collected, I distracted myself by completing my history of New York. And to my surprise, it took with the public and gave me celebrity. As an original work at that time was something unusual and remarkable in America. I found myself flushed with attentions. I was young and animated, and wherever I went, people wanted to meet me. I was admitted to the blazing splendor of Dolly Madison's drawing room in Washington, D.C. in 1811. And within half an hour, I was hand in glove with half of the people assembled. Ah, Dolly Madison. She is a fine, portly, buxom dame, with a smile and a laugh for everyone. But as to her husband, the president, Jimmy Madison, oh, poor Jimmy, he is but a withered little apple John. My brothers saw that I was never going to succeed at the law, and they wished me to devote myself to literature. They were all indulgence to me. They gave me an interest in their concerns, an import business in London. And for a time, wealth flowed in upon us. They only insisted that I not take an active role in the business, but only devote myself to writing. But I found myself unable to write. I had lost all interest in literary reputation. But then we were threatened with invasion by the British in 1812, and everyone was called to arms. I joined Mayor Tompkins, of New York as his military secretary. And for a time, for a few months, everything was exciting. But then the war ended, and I was once more left with nothing to do. So I went to England in 1815, and almost as soon as I arrived, my life took a change of course that altered the very tenor of it. You see, my brothers had engaged in risky financial speculations, and my name was implicated in their transactions. I saw the specter of bankruptcy on the horizon and knew that we could not escape it. This catastrophe seemed somehow more devastating even than Matilda's death. That had been solemn and sanctifying, and even as it prostrated my spirit, it elevated my soul. This bankruptcy was vile and sordid and humiliated me to the dust. I felt cast down. I felt abased. I had lost my caste. I resolved in my desperation to take my pen in hand once more and to raise myself from the degradation to which I considered myself fallen. Just as I was getting my pen into activity, I received a letter from my brother Ebenezer in America, offering me a position as Undersecretary of the Navy. I was at a crossroads. I declined the position. I wrote Ebenezer that I am quite unfitted for political life. My talents are merely literary. If I am to succeed with the public, it must be through the assiduous operation of my pen. You see, my pride was up. I would receive nothing as a boon for a ruined man. Now, I sought no lofty theme, as is very much the fashion with American writers today, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson. No, I addressed myself to the feeling and the fancy of the reader more than to his judgment. And if I have succeeded as a writer, it is because of the literature being of the type that it is intended to be. I have aspired only to play a flute accompaniment in the national concert, and I leave it to others to play the fiddle and the French horn. And so in this way, I produced the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman. You perhaps know of its success, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle, and I would gladly ascribe its success to its intrinsic merits, but I'm afraid the cause was a less flattering one. You see, I was looked upon as a surprise because I could write intolerable English. I was looked upon as a kind of demi-savage with a feather in his hand instead of on his head. And there was curiosity to see what such a being would have to say about civilized society. I found myself launched upon the literary society in London, especially at the home of my publisher, John Murray, where I frequently saw Sir Walter Scott. He is a man that if you knew him, you would love him. A right, generous-hearted, great-spirited being. And he has been a very good friend to me. He was the one who encouraged me to study and read German. And it was by reading the German folklore that I was able to get the inspiration for The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. So I continued to publish. I also traveled quite a bit at this time across Europe, in France and Germany and Spain. In France, I was able to renew an acquaintance with my New York neighbor, John Jacob Astor, who had been very successful as a fur trader, and he would eventually encourage me to write a chronicle of his lost colony at Astoria on the Pacific coast in Oregon Territory. Also in France, I renewed my acquaintance with my New York friend John Howard Payne, the young child Hamlet, the first person to perform as Hamlet in the United States, and the author of the play that contains the song Home Sweet Home. Now, John Howard Payne invited me to join him and a woman named Mary Shelley at the opera. Mrs. Shelley was a widow. She had also written a macabre story about body parts being assembled and electrified into life. Well, John Howard Payne was very interested in Mrs. Shelley. She was a widow. And unfortunately, it seemed that Mrs. Shelley was more interested in myself. I was embarrassed to find. John Howard Payne didn't hold it against me, but I'm afraid I wasn't able to reciprocate Mrs. Shelley's affections. And thus, I was able to produce in time another collection of tales and sketches, Bracebridge Hall in 1822, and Tales of a Traveler in 1824. Now, Tales of a Traveler, I estimate to be my best all-round of my literary accomplishments. But the critics savaged the work. They wrote, for example, in the New York Mirror, that this is a dull imitation of himself by a writer who was never very remarkable for originality of genius, richness of invention, or vivacity of fancy. They wrote, "No man in the Republic of Letters is more overrated than Mr. Washington Irving. His new work would sell more rapidly if the booksellers would alter the title and call it, instead of Tales of a Traveler, Stories for Children by a Baby 6 feet High." And yet, I was also accused of being indecent and an affront to the chastity of the Georgian home. You might ask me why that was the case when we entertain your questions. Why, not even my character was safe from attack. The Westminster Review wrote that Irving lives upon the smiles of aristocrats and would strike out his best passage, dilute his best argument, or recant his sincerest opinion in the fear of losing the next invitation to dinner he may expect from Grosvenor Square. Well, I was stung by these criticisms, and I turned from writing tales and sketches and became an historian, especially in Spain. You see, in 1828, I was invited by the minister to Spain to come and translate some of the documents of the voyages of Columbus. And in this way, I produced the life and voyages of Christopher Columbus and also a chronicle of the conquest of Granada and the companions of Columbus. And at the end of this time, I fell under the spell of a palace of enchantment and dream. For those imbued with a love of the historical and the poetical, the Alhambra is an object of devotion. How many legends and traditions, both real and imaginary, have been spun about this royal abode of the Moorish kings, where, surrounded by splendor, they made their last stand for empire in Spain. Oh, never shall I meet with a place more suited to my tastes or my customs and habits. The sole fault of the Alhambra was that the silence and serenity was so soothing and voluptuous that it sometimes made it impossible for me to write. At the end of my 3-month sojourn at the Alhambra, I looked back at it, feeling like a sailor setting sail on a stormy sea, leaving a tranquil port. I had been offered a position as secretary of the legation in London, the embassy there, and thus ended one of the pleasantest dreams of a life which you may feel was too much made up of dreams. It appeared to be the wish of my friends that I accept this diplomatic appointment, and it led later to other appointments, such as my appointment as ambassador to Spain in 1842, but I do not feel that I am suited for public life. No, I find myself too sensitive to endure the bitter personal hostilities and the slanders of the press that beset public life in the United States. No, I am content to retire now to Sunnyside, my estate in the Hudson Valley, and there I have undertaken to write a biography of George Washington, which seems to be running now to 5 volumes. I was away from this country from 1815 until 1832, 17 years. Why had I stayed away so long? I've often been asked, and for once I will try to answer. I had been believed to be treading the primrose path of dalliance, when instead I had been often struggling to find the money to support myself. And I had resolved never to return to this country until I would be above the pity of my friends, who had often offered me help, but I refused it until I could stand on my own 2 feet. So it was finally on May 21st, 1832, that I finally saw myself standing on a ship and seeing the blue line of the horizon rise like a cloud before me, where 17 years before I had seen it fade away. I again saw the bright city of my birth in its beautiful bay, its multiplied fanes and spires, its forest of masts, proclaiming its augmented glory. And I throbbed with admiration and love at being once again home. But how was the wanderer to be received after such an absence? Was he to be taken to his friend's bosom, or was he to be repulsed as a stranger and a changeling? I felt like my character Rip Van Winkle when I stepped off the ship. Everything about me seemed strange. There were enormous buildings in the place of lowly tenements. Even the very streets were altered. I was a stranger in my own home. But soon my friends from across a sprawling metropolis gathered to welcome me home, and never has such a wanderer, after such an absence, received such a greeting. And I was able to tell them that I was finally happiest at home. And so I resolved to take my pen in hand and to travel once again as a tourist, but not in France and Germany and Spain, but instead to the American West. And in this way, I produced a tour on the prairies, an account of an excursion into the hunting grounds of the various tribes in the western part of the United States. I had happened in Ohio into the company of Henry Leavitt Ellsworth, a recently appointed Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He had been appointed to superintend the migration of various tribes from the east to the west of the Mississippi, and he invited me to join his party as his secretary. I was delighted at the prospect of traveling by horseback across the prairies and the forests, of sleeping on skins and blankets under the open sky, and of hunting deer and elk and buffalo. I've always been fond of horse exercise, even then at the age of 49. It wasn't long, it was October of 1832, before we arrived at Fort Gibson in the eastern part of Oklahoma Territory. And there we were joined by about 100 mounted rangers, and we crossed the Arkansas. I had two servants named Bayot and Tonish with me, and they were familiar with Indian customs. So they fashioned a craft, a kind of raft or boat, out of a buffalo skin. And they invited me to sit down on top of the saddlebags and the saddles and the luggage. And thus, I found myself with a feeling half comical, half serious, on a buffalo skin in the middle of a wild river, surrounded by wilderness. And Bayot and Tonish had set out to steer the craft. Bayot took a cord between his teeth, which was attached to the prow of the craft, and Tonish followed behind to steady and propel it. And they began whooping and yelling. When we reached the center of the river, to please them, I discharged a double-barrel gun, boom, to the right and boom, to the left. But that was not the climax of my tour on the prairies. That was a buffalo hunt. Of all animals, a buffalo is, when hard-pressed by the hunter, the most diabolical of animals. He has two short black horns curving out of a shaggy frontlet of fur. His eyes are like live coals. His mouth is open, his tongue parched, and his tongue curls up in a half crescent. He is a perfect picture of mingled rage and terror. It was with difficulty that I urged my horse sufficiently close, and taking aim, to my chagrin, both pistols missed fire. I was close upon the buffalo when he suddenly turned and rushed upon me. My horse gave a leap, and because I was leaning far out to the side with my pistol extended, I was nearly thrown at the feet of the buffalo. Yet I managed to come away with the tongue of a buffalo of my own shooting as my trophy. And I resolved then never to resort to meaner game, but to rest upon my laurels as a hunter of buffalo. Thank you for listening, and now it's time for me to take some of your questions, if you have any. I am going to resort to my spectacles so that I can see you. Raise your hand and ask me any questions. Do I see any? I see a hand right here, yes. The young man in the black jersey. How many states were in 1800? Well, I've lived so long, I have lost track. Now, there were certainly the New England states. We had the 13 colonies when we fought our war for independence. I honestly can't recall whether Ohio and Pennsylvania had been added to our country by then. I'll look that up. Thank you. Yes? Was I ever married? Alas, no. I was engaged to marry Matilda when she died at the age of 17. I will tell you a secret, though. I did propose to another young lady in 1820s by the name of Miss Emily Foster in Dresden. I had become friendly with her family, and she was 18 years old. I was 40. I think maybe that had something to do with her declining my proposal.
Have another one
question.
right here.
Do I see another hand raised? Yes, right here.
I heard that you had to go to England because you did not like America for a little bit, but when you went to England, you started to notice why America was a little bit better than how England was, and I heard that your brothers actually forced you to go. Is that true?
Well, now that accusation that I did not love my country is one that I take very personally. I never intended to abandon America permanently. I always intended to come back. I was hoping to come back much sooner and even to be there before my mother died, but I, alas, was unable to be at her bedside. And as I said, I wanted to be able to come back a success and not dependent on other people. I made a series of bad investments, I'm sorry to say, in a copper mine in Bolivia and in a steamboat enterprise in France, and I lost all of the money that I had made from the sketchbook and some of my later books. So I waited to come home until I was ready, and then I thought it was important to tour America. Now, you're correct, though, that my brothers were very indulgent to me. They enabled me to write, and they constantly supported me in various ways, offering me jobs that they had found. But even though I'm devoted to my brothers, I had to find my own path. Thank you for that question. Other questions?
We've got them. We're just going to let them use the microphone so
I see.
everybody can hear what the
Well,
question
you've got a
is.
long line of them there, I see. Very good. Next.
What was it like being born right after a war?
What was it like being what after a war?
Being born right after a war, living in post-war times.
Well, I was an infant at the time. I'm not sure I was all that aware of how recently the war had been won, although we did enjoy our president, Washington. When I was 6 years old, I was able to meet my namesake. I was named for President Washington. My nursemaid Lizzie, a Scottish nursemaid, saw me, had me on the streets and in the shopping area, and saw the president go into a shop, and so she took me in, and she asked the president to lay his hand upon my head and give me his blessing, which he did. So we were very much in awe of our president in those early years after the war.
What year did you write your first book?
My first writings that were published were the letters of Jonathan Oldstyle, published in 1802 when I was 19 years old. And then the periodical Salmagundi followed that in a few short years later. But my first real book was in 1809, Diedrich Knickerbocker's History of New York.
Which one of your books is most successful?
Which of my books was most successful? Well, I have to say I've been fortunate to have many books that have been very successful. Certainly, Diedrich Knickerbocker's History of New York gave me a very great reputation and celebrity even at a young age. But the sketchbook, published in 1819 and 1820, it was published in serial form originally, was what really launched my career and was the most enduring of my successes.
When did you die?
I'm still alive. You'll have to wait.
Kendall, apparently somebody did not pay attention in introductions. That was covered in introductions.
Do you know who Ichabod Crane is?
Ichabod Crane is my character in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
Where was your most favorite place you went to?
My favorite place in...
The favorite place you went to as part of your travels?
It would be the Alhambra, the Moorish palace in Granada. It was a place of enchantment that was somewhat deserted and decayed at the time, and so the legends and the atmosphere of the place was very conducive to my imagination, and it resulted in my writing the tales of the Alhambra.
What was your family business, and why was it you couldn't work for them?
What was my family business? My father was a merchant, and some of his sons, my brothers, went into that business, the import business in England. However, others did not follow in the same footsteps. My eldest brother, William, went into law, became a United States senator. Peter was the importer along with Ebenezer. John Treat, my other older brother, was a lawyer. So we had a variety of family occupations.
Did any of your siblings pass away?
Yes, my favorite sibling, Peter, died in 1838, I'm sorry to say. My eldest sister, Anne, before that. William, even before that. So it has been sad to be the youngest in my family and to lose so many of my immediate family members.
How did you get the name Rip Van Winkle?
The name Rip Van Winkle is a wonderful Dutch name, and I, as a boy, would explore the Hudson Valley and learn the names of the old Dutch settlers. So I borrowed the name Rip Van Winkle from those boyhood rambles.
How old were you when your fiance died?
I was 22, I believe, yes. That was 1809. So I was 26, excuse me, yes.
What encouraged you to write?
What encouraged me to write? I would have to say that reading books of travel in my youth inspired me. I even read about the Alhambra as a young child, and so it was the dream of a lifetime when I finally went there.
Have you ever met George Washington?
You weren't listening either.
Where did he
I
get his
met him
name?
when I was 6 years old when my nursemaid Lizzie took me into the shop and have him bless me.
Can you tell us about your mom?
My mother, Sarah Irving, was the angel of the house. We were all devoted to her. I'm afraid my father inspired a little more fear than love. He was a very strict Episcopalian deacon. He insisted we go to church constantly. My mother, though, softened some of the harshness of my father's discipline, and I was her favorite. I was devoted to my mother.
Why don't you publish books underneath your name?
Why haven't I published books under my own name? I started by playing a kind of game with readers and hiding behind literary disguises, Jonathan Oldstyle, pretending to be old and odd when I was only 19 years old. Lancelot Langstaff and others in Salmagundi were kind of pen names that my brother William and James Kirkpalding and I hid behind so that we could poke fun with a certain amount of anonymity. And then that led to Diedrich Knickerbocker, and I actually used writing under that pseudonym as a kind of way to market my book, if you will. I started posting articles in newspapers talking about this mysterious man in black who had abandoned a manuscript in an inn, and letters were published asking if anyone had seen this funny little man. And so everybody started guessing who this man was, so that when my book, Diedrich Knickerbocker's History of New York, appeared, it was promoted as the missing manuscript of the funny little man in black. And that captured people's attention. It intrigued them. And then with Jeffrey Crayon in the sketchbook, he was very close to me in some ways. He became a kind of romantic tourist who stood in for me. And then, once I was so successful, my publisher, John Murray, wanted me to use my own name, but I kept insisting that I was writing in this other voice, and therefore Jeffrey Crayon's name, and not Washington Irving, should be on the title page. Some of my books were published with my name, even though I had asked that they not be. Eventually, though, I accepted the inevitable, and my name went on the eventual editions of my books.
What'd you do during the War of 1812?
In the War of 1812, I was the military secretary to Governor Tompkins of New York, and I had very little active role in the war, I'm afraid. It ended within a few short months of my becoming directly involved.
How many states did you travel?
How many stages did I
How many
travel?
different states have you traveled
States. Well, as you know, Oklahoma was not a state in 1832, so many of my travels were not in states, but I obviously spent a lot of time in New York State. I even went up into Canada in my early years, and I have visited Niagara Falls. I came down through Ohio and into St. Louis when I made it down to Oklahoma Territory. After I did my tour, I went down into Louisiana, and from there across the southern states, all the way to Georgia, and then back up to Washington, D.C. I've spent a number of visits in Washington, D.C., so I've covered pretty much the eastern part of this country.
Next to how many books have you written, and then what gave you the idea to write a book about a man who slept for 20 years?
How many books have I written? Well, my collected works keep getting reissued in different editions that are more than 20 volumes. Why did I write a story about Rip Van Winkle? Was that the other question? Yes. Well, as I said, I learned about German folklore, and I learned the story of the man who went into the mountains and discovered a mysterious group of people up there, and then fell asleep and woke up 20 years later. That was a German story originally, and in a footnote to Rip Van Winkle, I mentioned that people who read this story may recognize these sources. What I did was to reset the story in the Hudson Valley in the context of the old Dutch settlers, and to also connect it to American history in that Rip Van Winkle falls asleep while America is still colonies, and then wakes up 20 years later, and now we're no longer a colony, but we're an independent nation. So I was playing with this theme of how time changes people and places and even nations.
What was Sleepy Hollow like when you went there to base the Legend of Sleepy Hollow off of?
I went to Sleepy Hollow a number of times at a young age, and in fact, I finished writing Diedrich Knickerbocker's History of New York in a house named Kinderhook, owned then by a man named Van Ness, a friend of mine. but later it became the home of President Martin Van Buren, who was the secretary of the legation, who was the ambassador that I was the secretary to briefly in England later. So I had traveled to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow a number of times, and I also later bought my property Sunnyside right there in Sleepy Hollow many years after I had written The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And I think we may have time for a few more questions of Mr. Irving before I have to say goodbye and introduce you to someone who will take my place. Yes, a few more questions for Mr. Irving.
Who do you think killed Ichabod Crane and why?
Who do you think killed Ichabod Crane and why?
Well, I deliberately leave it ambiguous so that people who are superstitious can believe that the Headless Horseman attacked Ichabod Crane. He didn't kill Ichabod Crane, he just scared him so badly he left Sleepy Hollow. But if you read carefully, you will see many clues that it was really Brom Bones pretending to be the Headless Horseman who hurled the pumpkin at Ichabod Crane and frightened him nearly to death. So now I think we have time for one more question for Mr.
Yes,
Irving. Yes.
last question is going to be, kind of a lot of the stories you've shared, you've written at least early on, it sounded like. Maybe a little darker. You talked about the haunted house and some of these. Was there some experiences that you had as a child, or how did you get into that writing more than the other?
Well, my Scottish nurse Lizzie liked to tell me stories, and my brothers and sisters and I all love to hear these stories of goblins. So the question was whether I had ever actually experienced ghostly occurrences, maybe. But no, it was all based on stories, I have to say. Whoa. Well,
Speaking
on that
of scary.
note, I'm going to take off my literary disguise here. And introduce myself, John Anderson. I'm a professor at Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts. So now I can tell you when Washington Irving died. He died in 1859. He was 76 years old. He was living at Sunnyside with his nieces, Ebenezer's daughters, and a nephew, Pierre Monroe Irving, when he died of an enlarged heart. Not long after, just a few months after, finally completing his 5-volume biography of George Washington. So Irving couldn't tell you that because he didn't know, but I know. So I can answer further questions now. Many of you who have questions maybe would just as soon ask them of me as of Irving.
Can you talk about how much research went behind, how much study you've had to do, and why maybe you picked this character?
Yes, I first did a performance as Washington Irving in 1998 for the Oklahoma Chautauqua on early America. And they were interested in 5 characters who could talk about the early years of America. And Irving was of particular interest because he had actually been in Oklahoma as early as 1832. Now, I was working with other scholars who were performing as Abigail Adams and Thomas Paine and Father Asbury. So they were a little earlier than Irving. Born in 1783, he grew up with early America. He wasn't part of the Revolution directly. But that's how I got started doing Irving. And so I was really fascinated by his trip here to Oklahoma Territory. He was accompanied not only by Henry Leavitt Ellsworth, who wrote another account of the tour on the prairies, but also a young count from Switzerland named Albert Portalis. He was only about 18 years old, and his parents wanted to get him away from home for a while. He apparently had gotten too close with a young lady, and they were afraid he was too young to get married. So they sent him off from Switzerland all the way to Oklahoma, accompanied by a tutor named Charles Latrobe, who later became a vice governor of a province in Australia. So it was an interesting group of people traveling together in 1832, each of whom wrote their own versions of what happened. So I encourage you to read A Tour on the Prairies and these other accounts. I think you'll be proud of what you learn about Oklahoma, your home state, when it was still a territory. Yeah, we can take more.
All right, we've got a couple more questions before we finish up.
What's your favorite thing?
What do you like to do for fun, just you as an individual?
Well, I like to read. I'm like Irving in that respect, and my specialty is literature and theater, so I spend a lot of time going to plays and reading books. I also perform, in addition to Washington Irving, as the writers Henry James, William Faulkner, and Robert Frost, and also the Oklahoma playwright Lynn Riggs, who wrote the play that became the musical Oklahoma. So those are my favorite things to do, and then walking my dogs. Thanks.
Did Washington Irving just come up with the Headless Horseman, or was he already a legend in Sleepy Hollow?
Good question. Did Irving invent the idea of a headless horseman? He actually borrowed that from German folklore, and he then transplanted it into the context of the American Revolution, where there was a legend that a Hessian soldier, a man from Hesse, Germany, who was a soldier of fortune, a soldier for hire. The British hired these soldiers of fortune from Germany to fight the colonists, and the colonists hated them. Well, one of these Hessians had his head blown off with a cannonball, according to a legend. And so what Irving did is he took the German legend of the Headless Horseman looking for his head, and the Hessian looking for his head, and made the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow.
What motivated you to do this?
What motivated me to do this, right? Well, I have been studying literature and how to perform it since I was in middle school. I was in a Reader's Theater production of To Kill a Mockingbird when I was in 8th grade, playing Jim. How many of you have read To Kill a Mockingbird? Yeah, it's a wonderful novel, and that sort of got me hooked on this. And then I was also a collegiate debater. I participated in speech and debate activities all through high school and college. Do you have speech and debate here at your school? Great. Well, that's the start. That's how I got started. Thanks.
We want to thank you, and I don't know if there's any closing or anything like that, but
Thank you.